Thank you for joining me. This is Ron Clark with the Bible message. We're continuing in the book of Genesis, and we're coming up to chapter 27. Uh, Here we're going to find where God blesses in spite of family troubles. And we had talked about Isaac's passive faith. That's the background to the story of the blessing in Genesis 27. His poor eyesight physically parallels a spiritual dullness that sets up the scheme by which Jacob obtains the blessing. Rebekah and Jacob never would have gotten away with such a scheme without such a lack of wisdom and discernment on the part of Isaac. And Esau himself was also at fault with his own life. You see, in some situations, no one is entirely right. In fact, everyone can be wrong. I've at times had people approach me with a problem between people, that's what it amounts to, and they're trying to figure out, okay, who's right and who's wrong, and so they're sharing the different things so that they can kind of figure out where the fault really lies. And what they're missing is the realization that everyone can be wrong. There are many cases where everyone has fault. So there's a few cases where both sides are right in their own way. I remember the differences between Paul and Barnabas in the book of Acts, where Paul had a point, but then Barnabas had a point. They ended up splitting up, and two missionary groups went out. So God won in the end, but each of them had good points. But here we're going to see where everyone is at fault in some way, but God works through it in spite of the family troubles. But what's interesting to note is that there are consequences when believers, genuine believers like the people involved here, end up with suffering consequences in their lives because of their sin, because of their foolishness, because of wrong decisions. So family troubles afflict us today in many of the same ways. The only way to work through whatever troubles we have is for every family member individually to submit to God and His principles, and then that forms a basis for working it out better. So anyone that does not submit to God and His principles, whether a believer or not, they're setting up continuing and maybe even greater problems. We see some of that in the story of Isaac and his family. So even though what we do does have consequences, God is gracious in providing blessing based on faith and not just on our performance. All I can say for myself is thank God for His grace. I don't deserve the blessings I've had. I just thank God for working in my life that He's provided them. And He provides forgiveness. He provides restoration. He provides blessing. And you may suffer consequences like I do physically for some wrong decisions in the past. I've shared about that before, but it's a reminder to me that God works to bring us back to Himself, no matter what else might be happening here. That's His desire, and we need to submit to that and then enjoy the blessings of our fellowship with Him. So what happens in this chapter is actually the end result of unresolved problems and sins in the family. There's not an instant development of this thing, but rather it's a process of ending up here. And what's interesting to note in this whole passage is that nowhere does the whole family appear together. One of the great tragedies in America today is that with most families, the whole family doesn't get together hardly at all in a real family relationship and discussion and growing together and working through different issues. It's said that the average father spends only a few minutes a day with a child. It's also a tragic observation that so many families, they just eat on the run and then they go to their activities. So it's just a setup for many of the problems we have in our society. So Genesis 27, it actually is introduced by what Esau has decided that just shows his earthy, worldly, self-centered desires. In chapter 26, verse 34, when Esau was 40 years old, he took as wives Judith the daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and Basemath the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and they were a grief of mind to Isaac and Rebekah. Esau, just seeking to fulfill his own personal desires, goes and just takes 2 wives. It shows that he was not really following what God's principles were, because Abraham had made sure Isaac had married a believing wife. Rebekah was a believer in the true God and was faithful and showed it at several times, especially with the birth of the 2 boys. But also, it was not pleasing to his parents. He went to the Hittites and to get 2 wives. So not just 1, but 2. And then later on, he would pick a wife from among the Ishmaelites instead of seeking what God would want. We'll get to that later. But it just shows that Esau's life was one of a self-centeredness, a worldly orientation of experiences and of activities, much of which were good in themselves, but he doesn't show very much of a orientation to the Lord. There's no altar worship, there's no vows or prayer that are often connected to those that trust in the true God. So it's just those everyday things that you get involved in, and it's just one thing after another. He didn't subdue his own sinful fleshly desires. He just went with them. And at the time of the sale of the birthright to Jacob, it just shows that orientation, that the stew that Jacob had available was actually more important than the birthright, more important than what God's program was for them. So when he married these 2 pagan women, they were not believers in Jehovah. They were, believing the false gods and practices of the peoples of the land. He was showing that he was just disregarding what God wanted. And in effect, he showed how he had been disqualified from being the one through whom God would work, because he wasn't even responding to him. Now, Jacob and Rebekah are going to show themselves that they are maneuvering in order to get that blessing. That wasn't right either, but they're doing it from a standpoint of being believers, but then they want to step in and do things to get what God has said in their own power and with their own wisdom. So, in spite of all these things, Isaac's blessing does get passed on to Jacob. And we're going to see three acts in this section. Isaac's blessing is passed on to Jacob in through these three acts. Jacob getting the blessing was God's plan, but this was not the way of achieving his results. So I just can't help but wonder what would have been different with Jacob. Jacob goes into a 20-year period of labor. He has to deal with the deceptiveness of Laban, and then he never sees his mother again. How could it have been different for him? And sometimes you might realize that some of my difficulties are because I haven't been wise about following God's principles, and then you suffer for it. Doesn't mean they're not saved. It just means that you have something additional to deal with. Maybe it could have been different, but God's going to work through that in spite of those issues and those sins. A three-act presentation in this passage. Act 1 is what I call the setup. Act 2 is the scheme, and then Act 3 is the scene, and the consequences come out of that. Act 1, the setup in verses 1 to 5. So if you'll follow along in your Bible, I'll read it out loud. Genesis 27:1. Now it came to pass when Isaac was old, and his eyes were so dim that he could not see, that he called Esau his older son, and said to him, My son. Then he, Esau, answered him, Here I am. Then he said, Behold now, I am old, I do not know the day of my death. Now therefore please take your weapons, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me, and make me savory food, such as I love, and bring it to me that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die. Now Rebekah was listening when Isaac spoke to Esau his son, and Isaac went to the field to hunt game and to bring it. So the setup is that Isaac, lacking spiritual insight at this time, it shows that Isaac is just also blind to Esau's lack of love for God. At least Jacob did believe, did take serious what God was saying about them and the family. But that lack of spiritual insight leads to a lack of application of God's principles, ways, and wisdom, and to a lack of submission to God's will. Isaac had been told that the promise would go through the younger son, but he is ignoring that here. He is instead blind to Esau's lack of love for God and for Esau's life of just fulfilling his own desires instead of submitting to God and controlling himself and then submitting to God. You see, you can actually find yourself as a believer opposing the will of God because you have spiritual defective vision. You don't see things the way God does. And Isaac thinks he's okay. He even thinks he's doing God's will because he wants to make sure before he dies that he will not, that he'll pass on the blessing. So notice the emphasis on the senses. Everything except eyesight. Isaac's weakness provides the occasion for Rebekah and for Jacob and their scheme. You see, someone is always watching you, in addition to God. but other people are around you, or they find out about things. And the weakness of believers is essentially a spiritual and a wisdom issue. And being consistent with God's principles in our lives is important for God to be working things according to His will for us. We don't always understand everything God is doing, but we can trust Him. What happens with Isaac is that he's not looking at things the way God is planning and working. He's just moving ahead with what he thinks is best. So he calls on Esau to get some venison or something else, and then fix it the way that Isaac really likes it, and that at that special occasion he's going to pass on the blessing. We don't see where he is actually consulting with Rebekah. We don't see where Isaac is actually praying about this. And sometimes even believers today neglect those things to consult with our family or to seek wisdom from godly leaders that we trust, just to get their input about what we should do about something. Isaac isn't doing that. He's missing it at this point. So this Act 1 is the setup. The setup is to recognize how Isaac and then Esau are both not really following God's principles, but that Isaac thinks he can do God's program in his way. And that's where the fault is for Isaac as well as for Esau. We're going to see that this sets up the scheme that follows in the following section, verses 6 to 29. So what this scheme is that the use of ungodly schemes and methods may achieve the goal desired. It might get the goal that the person wants to have, but it is really accomplished only by God's grace, and only if it's God's will and plan. So this scheme that gets developed ends up getting the blessing for Jacob. But it's not really the way God would have accomplished it. We don't really know because it's not told what God would have done. Would God have had Esau recognize that Jacob should get the blessing? Would it have worked out that Esau would have told Isaac, no, I don't want it, give it to Jacob? Would Esau have passed away for some reason? We don't know what God would have done. But when this all gets worked out step by step ahead of time, and then Jacob gets the blessing by deception, God knew about this, and so he's going to work it out, but there will be consequences. So notice what happens here. We'll pick up at verse 6 in Genesis 27, or verse 5 where Rebekah was listening. So when Esau went out, verse 6, so Rebekah spoke to Jacob her son, saying, indeed I heard your father speak to Esau your brother, saying, you just have to imagine how this works. They live in these big tents, and the women and servants are typically separated from the patriarch and from some of the others in the tents, but you can hear through the tents. So we don't know all that was going on here, but Rebekah was listening. So she says, Jacob, I heard them saying this. That's what he said. Verse 7, bring me game and make savory food for me, that I may eat it and bless you in the presence of the Lord before my death. What's ironic about Isaac talking about his death, it would be decades until he actually died. So now, therefore, my son, obey my voice according to what I command you. Go now to the flock and bring me from there 2 choice kids of the goats, and I will make savory food from them for your father, such as he loves. Then you shall take it to your father, that he may eat it, and that he may bless you before his death. So she invites Jacob to go instead of Esau. And so she wants Jacob to get it because she knows what God's promise was through Jacob. But here she is making it happen through this scheme. So she goes on because Jacob objects. Jacob said to Rebekah in verse 11, Rebekah his mother, "Look, Esau my brother is a hairy man, and I am a smooth-skinned man. Perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to be a deceiver to him, and I shall bring a curse on myself and not a blessing." A legitimate objection. So his mother had an answer. But his mother said to him, "Let your curse be on me, my son. Only obey my voice and go get them for me." So this was a mother's foolish sacrifice for her son, because this was not the way God would want it. The curse would be that when Jacob left, she would never see him again. She would just hear about Esau and his family and the burden that they would be to him. How sad for her. So he obeys. Verse 14. He went and got them and brought them to his mother, and his mother made savory food such as his father loved. Then Rebekah took the choice clothes of her elder son Esau, which were with her in the house, and put them on Jacob, her younger son. How did she have the clothing that Jacob could wear that would be identified as Esau, when Esau had his own family and a separate living accommodation, maybe nearby? But how would she have it in her tent, especially since there's some sort of a distance between her and Esau, because Esau was Isaac's favorite and Jacob was Rebekah's favorite. See how favoritism just festers and can destroy. And she put the skins of the goats on his hands and on the smooth part of his neck. Then she gave the savory food and bread which she had prepared into the hand of her son Jacob. So she had made all these preparations and was ready for this to happen. Notice that Jacob did object at first, but his objection had to do not with the fact that it was wrong, but the fact that he might be caught. And how crazy it is when someone is only concerned about being caught, and then even when they might be caught, they don't really make a full restitution or a full confession about it. Drives me nuts when we see this with very corrupt officials, or when somebody is blamed for something and it's true, but then they make an excuse by shifting blame or not really owning up to it. But Jacob just agrees. So he went to his father in verse 18. He goes ahead and does this, and he lies to his father to deceive him. So he went to his father and said, "My father," and he said, "Here I am. Who are you, my son?" So he's questioning him, and Jacob said to his father, "I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done just as you told me. Please arise, sit, and eat of my game, that your soul may bless me." So he goes to him, and he's 2 lies. He's Esau, he claims to be Esau, and he claims to have done what the father had said. But Isaac said to his son, "How is it that you have found it so quickly, my son?" You see, apparently the Lord speeded up Jacob's answer was that the Lord speeded it up. So it's another lie. And he said, "Because the Lord your God brought it to me. So I went out to get it, and a deer jumped in front of me." Another lie. Notice that one lie will lead to others, because a lie is a new construction of what reality is supposed to be, and when other information comes to light, then another lie needs to be used to develop the structure of the lie. And we live in a lying culture today, don't we? It's just one thing after another that has to be said to cover it up and make the new construction of reality. So all these lies begin. Notice that the senses are the focus of Isaac, and he bases it on his own senses. He doesn't go beyond that to analyze things further. And senses are the way we learn a lot of things. But here he gets deceived. Verse 21, Isaac said to Jacob, "Please come near that I may feel you, my son, whether you are really my son Esau or not." So Jacob went near to Isaac his father, and he felt him, and Isaac said, "The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau." And he did not recognize him, because his hands were hairy like his brother Esau's hands. So he blessed him. Then he said, "Are you really my son Esau?" And he said, "I am," lying again. And he said, "Bring it near me, and I will eat of my son's game, so that my soul may bless you." So he brought it near him, and he ate, and he brought him wine, and he drank. And then his father said to him, "Come near now, and kiss me, my son." And he came near and kissed him. And he, Isaac, smelled the smell of his clothing, and blessed him, and said, notice all these senses, and he was being deceived by his reliance on his senses. Can't help but see the connection with the scientism of our day, which is essentially we're going to measure things based on our basic assumptions and beliefs, and based on what we can observe with our senses, with all our measuring devices, and with our eyes and our ears and our own reasoning, ignoring God and what God has revealed, but then just studying things according to what we can measure. And it limits what science can offer us. In fact, it's used to lead us astray. But back to Isaac and Jacob. And so, based on this evaluation by which Isaac was deceived, he goes on to bless Jacob. So the blessing is in several parts. The beginning is to just recognize who he's talking to. He says, "Surely the smell of my son is like the smell of a field which the Lord has blessed. Therefore may God give you of the dew of heaven, of the fatness of the earth, and plenty of grain and wine." So just physical, material blessing. And then power. "Let people serve you, and nations bow down to you." And that extends even to his brother. "Be master over your brethren, and let your mother's sons bow down to you." So that even in family, he would be the first one, or the leader of the family. And then a protection. "Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be those who bless you." So he passes on the Abrahamic blessings to Jacob, thinking that he is Esau. This is a verbal commitment of the blessings and the covenant to the person that is receiving it. And these kinds of verbal decisions and contracts were valid in that day. We sometimes lament that why can't we have somebody's word just be enough? Because that's the way it used to be, is that you could talk about something, agree to something, shake hands about it, that you both agree to it, and that both of you will fulfill it based on the word of mouth. But today we have all kinds of documents and have to get those verified or notarized, and then we have to uh, have other documents that verify these documents, and it becomes a very confusing process to do something like buying a house, buying a car, those kinds of things, business decisions. You have to have lawyers involved that do all the lawyer legal stuff in order to be protected, because can't trust everyone. But back at this time, this kind of an oral spoken commitment was acceptable and was held people accountable. So the blessing is given to Jacob, and that scheme worked, but it was not the way God wanted it to work. He wanted to give that blessing to Jacob in his time and way. And I've had to learn this over time, that sometimes the things you want, and I have a list of good things, I'm asking God for, and I'm just wondering, why am I waiting so long for some of these things? And I just end up coming back to the point that, okay, God, you know better, you're all wise, and you have your will and way, and you have your program that's unfolding in the lives of these other people that I'm concerned about, but also in my life. That we just wait until we see what God's will is and what His provision is. I'm trusting God to provide for me all my days. And how that happens, I don't always know. But God is faithful in working out His will. So the setup was Isaac's lack of spiritual insight and the uh, earthly, worldly orientation of Esau, but also the scheming and deception of Rebekah and Rebekah and Jacob. All those things contributed to the success of this scheme. And sometimes schemes work. That's why people keep trying them. So what happens is that God works through that anyway. So what happens is, in the next act, we see the consequences begin unfolding. The scene is Act 3. So we see how this scene and the consequences unfolding are more far-reaching than the different actors anticipated. Even though the blessing ends up being good and it's even God's will, and the enjoyment of that blessing is complicated in this life. There's some loss of enjoyment of God's blessings. This is exactly what the Hebrew people, when they left Egypt, they lost the blessing of entering the land because of their sin and their disobedience. They ended up wandering in the wilderness for that generation. It's what Christians miss when they give themselves into carnality and sin in their life. Instead of submitting to God and honoring Him with their life, they end up with heartaches and problems, even physical problems. sometimes God disciplines them harshly to try to get them to turn back. When they turn back, they may have consequences they live with. And we're going to see that with this next act, the scene that develops after this. The scene that develops are the consequences of ungodliness. You can be ungodly as an unbeliever, but you can be ungodly as a believer too. And these are far reaching. So, verse 30 begins these different consequences. So, verse 30, now it happened as soon as Isaac had finished blessing Jacob, and Jacob had scarcely gone out from the presence of Isaac his father, that Esau his brother came in from his hunting. So soon after this blessing had been taken by Jacob. So Esau, also had made savory food and brought it to his father, and said to his father, "Let my father arise and eat of his son's game, that your soul may bless me." And his father Isaac said to him, "Who are you?" Because he couldn't see him. So he said, "I am your son, your firstborn Esau." Then Isaac trembled exceedingly. He realized what was going on. He said, "Who? Where's the one who hunted game and brought it to me? I ate all of it before you came, and I have blessed him. Indeed, he shall be blessed." And when Esau heard the words of his father, he cried with an exceeding great and bitter cry, and said to his father, "Bless me also, O my father." He said, "Your brother came with deceit and has taken away your blessing." So Isaac saw then what had happened. This was the second time that Jacob had supplanted or connived Esau and tricked him. The birthright and now the blessing that birthright represented. Isaac trembled because he knew it could not be undone. And he also knew, in a very blunt way, it's almost like God smacked him in the face, that this fulfilled what God had said was supposed to happen. And he knew he had been wrong all those years by favoring Esau and then trying to give him the blessing. So, your brother came with deceit and has taken away your blessing. So Esau said, in verse 36, "Is he not rightly named Jacob?" Which means a supplanter or a conniver. "For he has supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and now look, he has taken away my blessing." And he said, "Have you not reserved a blessing for me?" Then Isaac answered and said to Esau, "Indeed, I have made him your master, and all his brethren I have given to him as servants. With grain and wine I have sustained him. What shall I do now for you, my son?" So Isaac is reviewing out loud what has happened. Okay, he doesn't really answer Esau right away, but he first just answers what has happened, that it's gone to Jacob. And Esau said to his father, "Have you only one blessing, my father? Bless me also, my father." And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. Now notice Esau's emphasis is to bless me. It's the second time he emphasizes this. "Bless me also, O my father." Back in verse 34, and now in verse 38. His focus is on himself and on what he gets. There's no mention here of what does God want in all this. And this is what Isaac should have been doing with Esau all these years. So Then Isaac his father, verse 39, answered and said to him, Behold, your dwelling shall be of the fatness of the earth and of the dew of heaven from above. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. And it shall come to pass when you become restless that you shall break his yoke from your neck. So he does give some blessing to Esau, and Esau's response is, verse 41, so Esau hated Jacob. So the consequences play out over time is that Isaac would live another 37 years, and he would just be stepping into the background in God's workings. It's interesting to realize that there are some Christians, because of decisions in disobedience, the way it's said is they get set aside from being as useful as they could be. Now they can repent and get back in walking with the Lord and find some area of service. But what I'm reminded of in particular is of a king in the Old Testament named Manasseh. His father was Hezekiah, a godly man. But Manasseh took over the kingdom and just was wicked for many decades. Toward the end of his life, he finally repented and was restored to the throne in Judah. And he tried to show his newfound faith and in Jehovah, but the people were too far gone. And I could just imagine him trying to do these things, and most people just sort of laughing behind his back and going on with their wicked ways and turning away from the true God. Some sins end up with serious consequences in a person's life. And what we see with Isaac is that he just ended up being set aside and overshadowed by Jacob. But what we have here in these consequences are, starting in verse 41. So Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, the days of mourning for my father are at hand, thinking that what Isaac thought was going to happen, not realizing it would be 37 years later. But when his father would die, he determined in his heart, then I will kill my brother Jacob. By killing Jacob, the blessing or the inheritance would revert back to Esau, but the blessing would not be his. It would not work out this way. So it goes on, and the words of Esau, her older son, were told to Rebekah. So Rebekah heard about it. She had her informants in the family and in the relationships with everyone. She got word, so he apparently would express this, and so the words were heard and passed on to her. She sent and called Jacob her younger son and said to him, surely your brother Esau comforts himself concerning you by intending to kill you. I can't help but wonder that Jacob would think this also, so it would confirm some of his fears and concerns, knowing the way Jacob was with his passions and uncontrolled behavior at times. Rebekah goes on and says, now therefore, my son, obey my voice. Arise, flee to my brother Laban in Haran, and stay with him a few days until your brother's fury turns away, until your brother's anger turns away from you, and he forgets what you have done to him. Then I will send and bring you from there. Why should I be bereaved also of you both in one day? So, what Rebekah gives Jacob is a plan to go away for a short time, not realizing that the consequences for her would be that she would never see him again the rest of her life. So then Rebekah goes to Isaac and said, I'm weary of my life because of the daughters of Heth. If Jacob takes a wife of the daughters of Heth like these, who are daughters of the land, what good will my life be to me? So just like we had noted at the end of chapter 26, that Esau had married two of the pagan women of the land, and that these were a grief of mine to Isaac and Rebekah because of their sinful lifestyles and other things, their disrespect perhaps. It also was such a burden on her. And she says that she doesn't want Jacob to have such a wife because that'll just make it all worse. And it would. It would. So I remember someone telling me one time that his brothers had married women that ended up being a grief to his parents. So he didn't get married right away, but later on when he was getting ready to get married, their comment to him was, well, you've been walking with the Lord, and so we trust you with your decision to marry. And he married a godly woman. Those things happen in families. They happen today. And many of us who are faithful Christians and parents, we sometimes have this with our own children who decide to turn away from the Lord, and then their married partners and that family also become a burden to us. And it's very, very sad and hurtful, and you pray and you hope for reconciliation. But in some families, it doesn't happen in this life. That's what happens with Jacob. That's what happens with Rebekah. That's what happens with Isaac. That's what happens with Esau. This brokenness just ends up with consequences the rest of their lives. So what happens is that Jacob would leave and end up being deceived by Laban. Esau would seek to murder Jacob, and he opposes God and God's ways. Later, he will mellow and settle and forgive Jacob, and then when Jacob returns, but that would be 20 years later, 20 years that they would meet. For Rebekah, we've mentioned that she would never see Jacob again in her life. That is a heartache for any mother. So Jacob goes away. We see where Jacob and Esau both have responses. So then Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and charged him. He calls him and blesses him because now he knows he's been rebuked by the Lord, and he realizes that through all this, God was working out his will anyway. So Isaac owns up to it, and he calls on Jacob and blesses him and charges him and said to him, you shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. Arise, go to Paddan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take yourself a wife from there of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. Again, at this time, marrying a close relative was not a danger genetically. That would happen in the later centuries among intermarriage of families over successive generations. But that the human race wasn't so weak by this point. But that's what Isaac charges Jacob to do, is to go and get a wife that's not one of these pagan unbelievers in the true God, but was chasing after other idols, other gods, other religious practices. So he blesses him. Verse 3, may God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you, that you may be an assembly of peoples, and give you the blessing of Abraham, to you and your descendants with you, that you may inherit the land in which you are a stranger, which God gave to Abraham. So he speaks the transfer of the promise to Abraham that Abraham had given Isaac, he now passes on to Jacob. So Isaac sent Jacob away, and he went to Paddan Aram to Laban the son of Bethuel the Syrian, the brother of Rebekah, the mother of Jacob and Esau, because he's hoping that among the family there would be a suitable woman that could be his wife. What does Esau do? Esau saw that Isaac had blessed Jacob and sent him away to Paddan Aram to take himself a wife from there, and that as he blessed him, he gave him a charge, saying, you shall not take a wife of the daughters of Canaan. And that Jacob had obeyed his father and his mother and had gone to Paddan Aram. To Jacob's credit, he was following their wisdom, and it was in fulfillment of God's plan. Also, Esau saw that the daughters of Canaan did not please his father Isaac. So Esau went to Ishmael and took Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Nebaioth, to be his wife in addition to the wives he had. So Esau, in his earthly wisdom, decides, well, I'm going to get a wife that might be pleasing to my parents. But he adds to the problems by taking a third wife. Every situation in the Bible where there's more than one wife, which was permitted by Moses because of the hardness or stubbornness of people's hearts, basically because they were so self-centered, that every instance of more than one wife has many problems. And that could be avoided by sticking with God's standard of one man and one woman in marriage for the life of each one. After one passes, then a remarriage is permitted, but that also ought to be in the Lord and with a fellow believer. So Esau takes it into his hands to again make a decision, trying to do the right thing, but in the wrong way. So we see how Esau responds. Verse 10, now Jacob went out from Beersheba and went toward Haran. And we're going to pick up with that the next time, with seeing how God is working in Jacob. Jacob's life and testimony take over from here. And we see here the setup, the scheme, and the scene, and the consequences that come out of doing things that are not the way God wants them, even though they fulfill what God wants. There are consequences and troubles that happen. And Jacob goes out with God's blessing, and we'll see how God works with him, because the consequences follow in Jacob's life too, but God is faithful through it all. God will be faithful to you, and even though you may fail at times, you can confess and be forgiven and be cleansed. There may still be consequences, but we can trust God to work through the whole package of our lives. And it's wonderful to walk with God. Thank you for joining me. God bless you all.